Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. Just going to be a couple of minutes before we start, just a few late arrivals. So sorry, we'll just be a couple of minutes, and then we'll get going. Just as a way of a little bit of housekeeping, if you've got, we did ask for some questions in advance. So thank you to everyone that did fill out those forms and filled those out. If you have questions throughout the night, please do post them in the chat and we'll try and get to those as well. We've only got an hour, so we will try and obviously get through as many as possible, but apologies if yours doesn't get answered. We'll try and either catch it in a kind of feedback kind of summary later on, or hopefully we'll have answered it throughout other questions as well. So thank you very much if you just use the chat. As you see, actually there we've stopped having people join, so I'll just I'll get started and introduce you to Richard Blakeway, the Housing Ombudsman, Andrea Kenoy, who is our Chief Operating Officer, and Danny Rawling, who is our Dispute Resolution Manager. They're going to be the three taking your questions today. And we will start with a pre-submitted question from Alison Bancroft. And Rick, if it's all right, if we come to you first. And it's about the unequal power relationship between landlords and their tenants. And do you recognise that exists? And if so, how do you take that and how do you kind of factor that into the decisions that you make?
Thanks so much, Mark, and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining. And I think this question was from Alison, and it's a fantastic question because it speaks to the heart of what is an ombudsman and an ombudsman's role. And obviously an ombudsman is free and impartial and independent, free to access, impartial, and we're impartial and independent in the way we can do our investigations. And we very much recognise that there is and can be an imbalance of power between the resident and the landlord. And that's reflected, therefore, in our approach to investigation. And the best way of describing that really is to contrast it to how the courts would approach something and then how we would approach something. So the primary difference is the way in which we treat evidence. And as an ombudsman, we're active in the evidence gathering for an investigation compared to the courts, which will rely on the evidence that is presented to them in the court. We're also inquisitorial in the way in which we interrogate that evidence. And I mean, that basically means we're curious. We ask questions. We try and understand the reasons for something. So that is another key difference to the courts, whereas the court process is adversarial. And it's essentially which argument is kind of most effective in the courtroom. And then I think the third strand, which addresses this kind of imbalance of power, is that we consider what the individual circumstances are in each case. So whereas the court will make a decision based on what the law says, we will make a decision based on what the law says, but also what's best practice and what would have been fair in the circumstances of the case. And taking into consideration those circumstances should help address that imbalance of power that can exist. So I think those are some of the ingredients that we use when we do our work. And I think, as I say, it's absolutely the essence of why is an ombudsman's approach different to the court's approach.
Thank you. Our next question didn't have a name by it, but if we could, if Danny, if you wouldn't mind answering this one, it's how can an elected resident board or a group of residents or a resident group help a resident make a complaint?
Yeah, absolutely. So to start with, I wasn't sure on the question whether it was to do with how a board or a group could support a resident in making a complaint to their landlord, because in the first instance where we expect landlords to have a a complaint service and complaint process that is accessible to all, and that includes making sure that residents can have the facility to have somebody acting on their behalf if that's what they require to allow them to progress a complaint through a landlord service. So our code is very clear on that, and we want landlords to make their complaint services as easy as possible for residents to access, and that includes making sure that they can have those representatives acting on their behalf if required. In terms of access to the Ombudsman service, again, residents can have a designated individual acting on their behalf to bring a complaint to our service. That does mean that that person does have to take responsibility for that complaint and sort of liaise with our service on their behalf. So it's maybe not always the best course of action for somebody to take. They may want a sort of another advocate to act on their behalf, but it very much depends on the needs of the individual resident. But as I said, it comes back to our expectation that the landlord is making that service as accessible for everybody. So we don't have a sort of definitive view on what the elected resident board or elected resident panel would, the actions that they'd have to take, but we do want to make sure that the landlords are making that facility available for residents to have that support if it's required for them to raise a complaint effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. I think the next question actually Dana's just actually raised in the chat as well, and that's one I think if bring you back in, Rick, on this one, and it's about what our jurisdiction is on service charges. This particular, say Dana's put in the chat about charges for heating and hot water, but we do get questions about service charges a lot and actually how we can get involved within that.
Yeah, thanks very much. So there's, if I try and deal with kind of service charges in general, and then maybe try and say something about heating and hot water. So specific, although obviously I don't know all the details of the particular issue that's driving Dana's question. So on service charges more generally, there's a role that the Ombudsman plays, and there's the role that the courts play, or the first tier tribunal plays. And for us, we are able to consider service charges, and when we're looking at whether or not the residents got sufficient information on why the service charge has been made and why it may have changed, whether there's been not only proper communication but proper consultation, particularly where consultation should have taken place. Whether the service has actually been provided, so the resident may say, look, I get this is the charge, and but I'm not actually receiving that service, or I don't think that service is being delivered effectively. And those are all things which we can look at, and I think those are really fundamentally important things. Now, if a resident feels very strongly, well, look, this charge is just wrong, and I think it should not be set at this level, ultimately only the tribunal could make a decision to change the level of the charge. But I think the work that we can do is both very valuable for the resident in its own right, but may also mean that the resident, after considering it, may decide to go to the tribunal and actually say, look, I want the charge to be different. So that's hopefully a kind of explanation that helps you understand what we can do and the really valuable role that we can play around charges, and then what's for the tribunal. On heating, and I saw you popped in some further comments around Lambeth. I won't talk about a particular landlord or can't talk about your case, but on heating and hot water, we particularly see this with heat networks or district heating systems, and they're given lots of different names as well, where a resident isn't necessarily aware that they're connected to the system, or a resident might want to disconnect from the system, particularly because they're concerned about the charges, and then obviously changes to those charges, or potentially about the level of service because there may be outages or something like that. And again, we can look at a lot of those issues in terms of how the landlord is managing the provision of the heating. There will be, particularly with heat networks, a role for the Energy Ombudsman, which is a separate body, which is around the kind of supplier questions on the supplier side, but we will look at the provider side and the landlord and tenant side. So I hope that helps a little bit there. Ultimately, when we receive a case, and this is something that happens in Danny's team, we assess it, we decide what we can look at and what's in our jurisdiction. If something is not in our jurisdiction, then we'll offer you advice on what you might be able to do to pursue that element of the complaint.
Thank you, Rick, and Dan has put in the chat a thank you as well, and a good to know reader jurisdiction. So thank you for that. We've had another anonymous question that was pre-submitted, and it was about complaint timescales. And Andrew, I wonder if could bring you in on this one about are we adding some more resource to help deal with that?
Yeah, of course, Mark. So, I mean, we do acknowledge some of our complaints are taking longer than we would like at the moment. And the history to that is we experienced a massive increase in demand for our service back in 21-22. Demand for formal investigations grew by almost 80%. And then last year we had another 30% growth in demand on top of that as well. So we've seen really big increases in people coming to us because they're still not satisfied with their landlord's complaint handling or the service delivery. And I think really reflective, I think, of what we see out there, all of the, media coverage as well, and awareness raising that is going on. When we first saw those surges kind of in our volumes coming through, we began discussions to, with our sponsor department, increase our budget. And that takes a little bit of time to go through. And then once we have budget approval, we then have to go out and do the recruitment and train our staff as well. And it takes a good 6 months for people, once they join us, to actually get up to speed with what we do, because it is quite unique, our role. There are other people who know about housing and do housing elsewhere, but they don't do ombudsman decisions. And there are other people who've worked in ombudsman elsewhere, but they don't know housing. So it does take a little while for people to really get up to speed and do the kind of quality of work that we want in those inquisitorial decisions that Rick spoke about earlier. But we have expanded an awful lot, and that is starting to come through now into the volume of decisions that we're issuing each month. So we have grown over the last 18 months from about 80 people in our dispute support and resolution team to about 350 now. That's a really, really significant expansion. And then the number of cases that we're getting out each month. So in the first 6 months of the year, it has doubled over what we did in the same period last year. So we are getting to the point now of lots of those resources that we've brought in. They're now working really effectively, and we're getting lots more cases out. So case times are starting to come down, and we're going to sort of continue with that. We've got more recruitment planned as well. There we go.
Thank you, Andrea. Really good overview on that. Thank you. We've had a question from Kim Heyman, and Rick, it'd be great to kind of bring you in on this if that's okay. And it's about the RAAC concrete, the big issue that was going around with schools, and whether that might be an issue within social housing. Do you think it's an issue? And how should providers deal with it? How should residents kind of react to the news?
Yeah, I mean, very topical, and obviously, given wider concerns around building safety, a really important issue for the sector. The regulator of social housing recently wrote to all landlords, and they set out, or private registered providers, and they set out their understanding of the situation in relation to RAAC in social housing. And their assessment was that actually it was quite limited in its use in social housing, and therefore the number of buildings where there may be issues will be relatively small. At the same time, they were clear that with individual landlords that they need to know about the safety of their buildings, where there may be issues, and have a proper placing plan to deal with that, given the inherent risks with that type of building. So I think that's the best kind of source of intelligence that we've got on what the situation is. I mean, clearly for us, if we see a complaint that may relate to it, then we would obviously investigate what may have happened in that complaint, and then, if necessary, share any relevant information with, with the regulator, who will ultimately have oversight of this, as well as, the wider building safety regulator and its responsibilities around building safety.
Thank you very much. Our next pre-submitted question was from Selena, and Danny, if I could bring you in on this, that would be great. It's about should my landlord be handing over the damp report it had done on my home, and if it doesn't or isn't handing it over, what can and should I do?
Okay, so I think this is a really, really interesting question, really. It ties into lots of different things that we often look at when a complaint's brought to us. So what we're doing, if it's just to talk about what you've raised, Selena, if you had a complaint that the landlord wasn't providing that information to you, it would probably be as part of a wider complaint around how that damp had been managed in the property. So what we'd be doing when we looked at the case, we'd be looking over the landlord's decision making there, whether it's been fair. We're taking into account all the different factors involved, and it may mean that as part of the outcome we deliver on that case, that we order the landlord to provide information that that was included within the damp report. For example, we have obviously something that Rick mentioned earlier is sort of the jurisdiction of other different organisations that are involved in information provision and sort of the different aspects we look at. And obviously with sort of data sharing, we have the Information Commissioner's Office as well. So there can sometimes be areas of a case where we're not able to insist that a landlord follows a certain action, but we do always want to encourage landlords to be transparent in their decision making, and often with cases involving repair issues, the orders do include instructions for the landlords to share information that they've sort of gained as part of their investigation into an issue that a resident is experiencing. We also have, as part of the social housing regulation bill coming up, sort of probably within the next few months, there's going to be an access to information scheme, which is designed to increase transparency for social housing residents and aims to increase the availability of information that they request from landlords, and sort of gives a framework for that to be managed in, and that could include maintenance related information connected to a property. And the Ombudsman will have a role to play in that we'll be able to pick up the appeals that residents have if they feel that their landlord hasn't responded to a request like that adequately. So at the moment, we're looking sort of on a case-by-case basis on the facts, but there is a sort of wider conversation taking place around what access to information, property related information, looks like for residents and our role within that. So I hope that's useful there, Selena. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. That's really good. And if I could stay with you just for the next question, if that's okay.
Of course.
And that's just about how do we manage complaints around communal areas, and what kind of orders do we make in relation to that? I think we do get quite a few questions around communal areas. It'd be great to kind of hear about that.
Yeah, we do, and it very much depends on the sort of the facts of the case, because we could have a complaint about how a landlord's maintained communal areas, for example, cleanliness or something like that, or we could have a complaint about how a landlord's communicated with a resident about items left in a communal area or repairs that have been affecting a communal area for some time. So it comes back to sort of very much a case-by-case basis. In all cases, we're looking at how a landlord's managed the complaint and the reports that they've received. And the orders can be very wide-ranging, like the rest of our casework. It could involve financial redress. It could involve instructing a landlord to review sort of their guidance around a certain aspect of how they manage a particular area. It could include information provision to the residents that have been affected by that particular point of a complaint. I would say what's really useful is to have a look at our decisions archive on our website. We have we publish all our decisions on there, so you can take a look through, sort of drill down into any particular areas that you want to find out a bit more about how we think through. And it just, there's a lot of information on our website around our decision making process with full details of the cases involved, so that should be helpful.
Thank you very much. That's great. can you see you've got your hand up? I'll just come to you after we've gone through some of the rest of the pre-submitted questions, and then I'll come back to you. But I've seen your question in the chat, so don't worry, it's noted, and we'll get there, I promise. The next pre-submitted question was from Jill, sorry, and Rick. It'd be great if I could bring you in on this one, and is what measures can be introduced to ensure that housing associations and board members are more accountable to their tenants? For example, could poor performance and tenant dissatisfaction count toward breaches of the regulator of social housing standards and in turn affect gradings? So obviously a lot there about the new powers and things.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And Jill, this is a great question. And yes, I think the thrust of your question is definitely the direction of travel that you're seeing. And I think, the context here is over the last few years, there's been quite rightly a debate about, are residents being heard? Are landlords sufficiently responsive to the needs of residents? Are they taking that into account in the way that they develop the organisation, the way that they put resources in place, the way in which they engage with residents? And I think we and our work around complaints has been part of that. Now, there's a couple of things, and they all, a lot of them relate to the Social Housing Regulation Act, which became law in the summer, and now you'll see over the next few months and years that unfolding and different parts of that act coming into place. And there's stuff that relates to us from that act, and there's stuff that relates to the regulator. And if I just briefly touch on both, because I think both are relevant for residents, because ultimately your question is about residents being able to hold their landlord to account and having the information, the tools to be able to do that. And I think it's not a one size fits all. There's going to be lots of different ways in which residents can engage, different powers, different sets of information, different measures, and all of that should come together cumulatively to make a big impact and a big difference for residents. So for us, there's a couple of things which I think are really important. Firstly, we have a complaint handling code that has been around for a few years, and it's an integral part of what we do as an ombudsman, because whilst resolving disputes is at the heart of what we do, but also setting complaint standards is a key part. So what we're doing through our complaint handling code is saying this is what good looks like, and this is the standard, the gold standard that landlords should be meeting. And whilst that code's been around for a few years, we've only been able to do something when we receive a complaint. But obviously the point at which we receive a complaint, something could have gone wrong. Many residents could have experienced a disadvantage from those things not working. So under the new law, from next year, from next April, our code will be a legal duty for landlords to follow, and we will be able to intervene even where we don't have a complaint. So if we see something's not working, we can do something sooner. Or if the landlord's not responsive to us, telling us what it's doing, we can do something sooner. Now, residents can be involved in that as well, because one of the things which we've said with the code is that the landlord should self-assess against it. And we are encouraging landlords to involve residents in that self-assessment. So it's not just their view on how they're doing, it's also the residents' view on how they're doing. So I think that's a really, really important difference that residents can make, and is one way of residents holding landlords to account. And as with all of our work, we'll be really transparent about what we're finding, so residents can obviously, again, use our information and what we publish as part of that. Second thing to flag is that we publish every year an annual landlord performance report. And those performance reports set out what we've seen, what we've handled, and what the outcomes are. And it's not always bad. There's some landlords that perform really well in terms of complaint handling, and then there's some landlords that don't perform very well. But again, we publish those reports. We have information in those reports, so different landlords can be compared against each other. So you get a sense of what's the average, and where is this landlord, where is your landlord? And again, through any engagement mechanisms, that is important information you can use to hold the landlord to account. And the final bit to flag is that, and it goes back to this code, is that we're encouraging boards to identify someone who can lead on complaints within the boardroom. It doesn't necessarily They're not responsible for the whole board on complaints, but they are a facilitator for the board to engage on complaints. And we're doing a lot to try and empower those people. And sometimes if a board member's on residents on the board, it may be them performing this role, but whoever it is, we're providing tools and materials to empower those people to hold landlords to account through the executive to account through the boardroom. And obviously it's really important that they're engaging with residents in terms of forming their view and how they perform that role. Now, all of that information is not only available to residents, available to the landlord, is also available to the regulator, who has a separate role. And so they, from next year, will start publishing what are called tenant satisfaction measures. And those will cover a whole range of different things about, you know, the quality of kind of repair services through to the quality of complaint handling. And those are measures which will be public, and those are measures which the regulator will take into account when holding landlords to account. The regulator will also start to inspect landlords. Larger landlords will be routinely inspected, so that's more than 1,000 homes. Those landlords will be routinely inspected, and then there'll be reactive inspections where issues come up. Now, the regulator is going to say a bit more about how it will then do gradings and all of that, if it does do that, and how that will work. But that will come after their current consultation, which they're doing on consumer regulatory standards and what those standards involve, because there's a whole range of stuff in there, from transparency to antisocial behaviour to more vulnerable residents. I mean, there's a whole load of stuff in there. So that's the kind of regulator's role. So those are some of the things which are changing under the Social Regulation Act, Social Housing Regulation Act, and I think it's, you know, and it's you know, what it's really doing is providing the tools to actually affect change, and ultimately most landlords will really engage, I hope, with this stuff, and therefore seek to go beyond what the law requires and really kind of, you know, deliver really, really effective, really responsive services for their residents.
Thank you, Rick. Really, really great answer. And really kind of, if anyone's got any kind of supplementary bits on that, then please do pop them in the chat. So lots of changes coming down the track. So no, thank you for that kind of overview. The next question, and I'll leave it up to the three of you who responds to these now, because these are ones that have been coming through during the session, but one's from Daisy about how, so some of the Housing Ombudsman complaint determinations are being applied retrospectively against policies and attitudes that are now in place. How do you kind of deal with that, and do you think that's fair, is the question.
I'll take that one. I'm gonna so when we make our decisions, we're really clear that we don't apply hindsight to the decision, so we consider what were the circumstances at the time. So, for example, sometimes landlords will tell us, actually, the complaints approach that we had in place at the time was not the one that we have now, but we have to base our decision on what was their approach, what was their policy at the time. And we're really careful, therefore, not to apply hindsight to the decisions that we make. We do publish sort of best practice, whether that's our complaint handling code or whether it's deep dives into areas like damp and mold. Often those reports reflect what would be accepted practice over quite a long period of time. It's kind of emerged as this is a really effective way of handling it, and therefore it may be relevant to refer to those documents, or reports, even if they've been published after the events of the complaint, because it's accepted kind of good practice, and it illustrates what is good practice in relation to you know, a particular issue, whilst again making sure that we avoid applying any kind of hindsight to our decision making. So I think, yeah, you know, it's only fair and reasonable to consider the circumstances at the time of the events, so that's what we do. If ever a resident or a landlord is unhappy with our decision, though, it can be reviewed. They can make a review request, and that's dealt with by a separate team, and a fresh pair of eyes will look at the decision and make sure it's robust, because ultimately we want to make the right decision, not only because that's fair for the individuals involved, but also that gives our decisions the authority to say, look, these are the lessons, this is the learning you can take away from complaints, and hopefully apply to improve services and improve practices.
Thank you. I think next question I'll come to Danny, if that's okay. It's from Mary, who's asked if we could just give a bit more information about how the dispute resolution team work and at what point in the complaints process they get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what I'll do actually is start with our dispute support service. So our dispute support service exists to provide support to residents who have ongoing complaints with their landlord that are within the landlord's complaints procedure. That could be from an initial inquiry from somebody to sort of ask how they go about approaching the landlord about a complaint, or somebody who has made a complaint and feels the process has stalled and wants us to sort of intervene and try and support the progression of that complaint. So that the intervention that dispute support offer does vary depending on what the circumstances that the resident is bringing to us consist of. And then once a complaint has completed the landlord's complaints procedure and the resident has come to us to say, I've had my final response, I'm not happy because of these reasons, that's when our triage and mediation service take a look at the complaint, and that's the team that I co-manage. So what we're doing there is like Andrea mentioned earlier, we're looking at whether that case is within our jurisdiction. We're looking at whether the intervention that we can offer is best placed to be an investigation, or whether we can perhaps mediate on that case and try and provide an earlier resolution without the case going to investigation. That is always with the agreement of the resident and the landlord, and we do that in cases where we feel it's going to be the most effective action for our service to take. And then if we decide the case is going to progress to investigation, we then start to gather the evidence. So we're contacting the landlord to explain what we need to be able to look at this case, and that's usually sort of the policy and procedural information, the correspondence relating to that particular complaint and what's taken place. Also all the records as well, because we need to be able to assess all the information there. And obviously the resident does get the opportunity to provide any information they want us to look at as well. That then goes forward to our dispute resolution team, where our investigators or adjudicators would take a look at all the facts on the case file and then make a judgment and provide a determination on that particular case. Does that answer your question, Mary? Sorry, you're not able to speak at the moment, but do let us know in the chat if you've got anything else you want to ask.
Thank you, Danny. Yeah, Mary, definitely. If you've got anything to add on top of that, then yes, please just put it in the chat. But no, thank you. That was really good, and actually links to another question we've had from Michael Baker, who's just asked, do I still have to follow a stage 1 and 2 process if the Ombudsman has to intervene early? So I assume this is at dispute support stage. The Ombudsman's had to intervene. Do they still have to follow stage 1 and 2 processes?
Okay, so we do, our role is to look at the complaint when it has completed the landlord's complaints procedure. However, we do appreciate that in some circumstances that doesn't take place, and that can be because of an issue with the landlord progressing the complaint how we'd expect, and in that circumstance we do have the power to accept the complaint for investigation early, but generally speaking, if a resident's getting support and input from our dispute support colleagues, then that doesn't overrule the stage 1 and stage 2 complaints process. It supports it, and then when we get the final complaint response and confirmation from that resident they want us to look at a case, that's when we start our sort of more formal intervention, which I described. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll now come to a couple of questions from Kenya Sue, who's asked about energy service charges and what residents can do when landlords opt in to certain bits of tech, basically without consulting residents, and or very small window for consultation, not being informed prior to installation. I don't know if we have a view on that, about kind of how about consultation times and how residents should be informed?
Okay, let me have a shot at that. I think there's kind of two principles here. Is firstly, regardless of what the kind of law says or the policy says, and there could be obviously a huge spectrum in terms of what's happening. Does it require a Section 20 formal consultation through to, you know, what smaller scale interventions? Regardless of what the law says, or the landlord's policy may say, there's obviously an overriding importance for landlords to be engaging with residents around changes that they're making to their home, and particularly in relation to heating and hot water, and the use of new technology, given the focus on reducing carbon emissions. And one of the things which we have highlighted is our concern that landlords aren't always communicating effectively with residents. So residents may not be aware at the point of a new letting about the system that they're connected to, or they may not be aware of changes that are made to the system. And sometimes this may be as straightforward but fundamental as you know, being able to use the system and effectively operate this new technology, because sometimes it is not as intuitive as it needs to be, and time and effort has not been taken to make sure that residents can interact and interface with it properly. And we set out these concerns in a report we published on heating and hot water. It was called Cold Comfort, the report we published a couple of years ago. And we make very, very clear recommendations to landlords on how they could improve practices, as well as our own, you know, our own approach to investigation. So I think in terms of the specific requirements, it will depend on what the law requires. That will depend on the type of intervention being made. It will depend on what the landlord's own policy says about engagement with residents and consultation, and whether or not it is followed that. And then we'll make a judgment as to whether it's met those, or what it did. Was that really reasonable? Was that reasonable? But we'll have to make that when we investigate the case and consider the circumstances of the household. So, you know, and that's where, you know, it's so important to always look at our casework and recognize that what we're doing is making a decision based on what was fair in the circumstances, and that involves obviously the household who was, you know, involved in the complaint.
Thank you very much. I think, Andrew, if I could come to you on this next one, and it's from Maya, who's asked if the Housing Ombudsman is covered by Freedom of Information Act legislation, and do we issue data about our overall determinations yearly?
Interesting question. So yes, we are covered by the Freedom of Information Act. So if you have a question, send that in. We've got a dedicated email address on the website, on our website as well, to make sure the complaint comes into the right team and we will be able to respond as quickly as possible. And sorry, I can't see the question on screen. What was the other part of the question, Mark?
If we do anything to kind of like publish our complaints data.
Yeah. So good question as well. So what we have every year is our annual report and accounts. In that, we publish information about our performance against sort of our KPI targets, key performance indicators, and a host of other data and information about the complaints that have come to us, how quickly we've handled them, the types of complaints that we've had as well. There's lots of information contained in that report. So that's one thing to look out for, and there's a whole series of them again on the website going back a number of years, so you can look at you know, the historical trends. And actually, when in each year when we publish that information, we do show comparative information for you as well, so you can kind of see a change from one year to another. But the other thing that Rick mentioned earlier as well, the annual complaints review, quite often that sort of picks up some sort of themes coming out of our decisions we've made, potentially on volumes as well. While it's largely more focused on individual landlord performance, just sort of putting that in a bit of context as to you know, how we've delivered as a service and what we've seen coming into us as well. So it's another source to have a look at with a bit more background for you.
Thank you, Andrea. The next question is from Sue, who asked about if there's a facility on the website that shows reports from a particular service area. So rather than being a general topic such as repairs, do we have anything that is more drilled down on so that people can see different cases?
Yeah, absolutely. There are lots and lots of filters on our decisions database. You can drill down whether you want to see complaints about a particular area or complaints where we delivered a certain type of outcome. So I think we can share that link hopefully in the chat, Mark, and then everybody can see and sort of filter away and have a look at our decisions. That's useful.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. Nick Master has asked, what can residents do when internal communication between landlords, staff or departments fail? So this is a question about kind of some officers not listening to complaint officers, and what residents can do in that situation.
You want me to take that one? So I think some of this comes back to the complaint handling code that we've been talking about and mentioned a few times, and that is sort of under consultation to become statutory at the moment, but nonetheless at the moment is still best practice for landlords to follow. So that sort of sets out, we've mentioned the stage 1 and stage 2 complaint process, and Danny spoke a little bit earlier around our dispute support team and how they work and what they can do. So within that code, we set out really clear timescales. If you are raising a formal complaint, how quickly the landlord should respond to you to say they've acknowledged it, how quickly they should send the stage 1 response back to you, and then if you're still dissatisfied, the stage 2 response. So if you aren't getting the responses within those timescales, you know, for whatever reason is going on in the landlord, lack of communication, not acknowledging anything with you, that's where our dispute support service comes in. And if you kind of bring the complaint to them, they can see that there's, you know, evidence that the landlord has failed to acknowledge the complaint or progress it within those timescales in the code. We will write to the landlord and we give them a couple of warnings. And then if they still have not managed to give the response back to you, we will issue what we call a complaint handling failure order that then kind of requires them to actually respond to you. And ultimately, as Danny mentioned before, if they still aren't progressing the complaint, we can take that into formal investigation. What we do with those CHFOs as well is publish a quarterly report on our website, which kind of has in it a table of every landlord that's received a CHFO in that quarter, whether they complied with it or not, and sort of, you know, highlights of learning from CHFOs for landlords as well. So they get kind of named in a report for actually not complying with their obligations under our scheme and the code, which will become statutory as well later.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. The next question is from Dana again, and I think it's a bit of a follow-up from the group complaint question that we had earlier. And this is just a bit more specific about, can we take complaints from tenant resident associations or tenant management organizations on behalf of residents regarding communal issues? I don't know who wants to come in on that.
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, look, the short answer is yes, but considering it as a group complaint may not always be the best outcome for the individuals who are part of the group. So if a group does want to complain, you know, and we've certainly done some investigations involving groups, and you know, and that's, you know, you can see reports on our website if you use that search facility where you can look at the kind of group complaints that we've considered. And you know, when it's submitted, you can have a look at we have to do a kind of check to make sure that it's a valid group complaint. So for example, we'll need evidence that every member of the group actually really wants to complain. The issue, I think, in terms of whether it's the most effective route, will depend on whether everyone in the group has been impacted by the situation, by the reason for the complaint, and you know, have they all experienced this impact? And that's something which is a key test for us, and I think you know, often leads to us deciding whether it works or not as a group complaint. But to give some examples of where, brief examples of where we have considered a group complaint, and I think it was really effective to investigate as a group rather than individuals, involved, for example, a supported accommodation where the residents had care support removed suddenly by the landlord, but in each of their tenancy agreements with the landlord, that care support was set out in quite a prescriptive way. You know, it should be in person, the regularity of it, and so on. So we could see very clearly from the tenancy agreement that there was an obligation to each of those individuals who were part of the group complaint, and we could see clearly, because it was removed as a whole from the group, that the impact was the same on you know, the impact it impacted each resident in that group. So that decision worked really well, I think, as a kind of group investigation. Another example we could use that we did recently was where there was parking and controls around the parking that was introduced on an estate, and again the impact that it had on a single block of that decision. And so, you know, sometimes a group complaint can work really, really well. Yes, we can consider them, but also sometimes we might say, actually, we're going to investigate this in as separate complaints, because that would be the best outcome for the residents in our view.
Thank you very much for that response. If there's any kind of follow-up to that, then yeah, once again, please do just pop that in the chat. The next one is a follow-up from the kind of regulation and powers question, and that was just from Mary wanting to know a little bit more about the board complaints lead person, and if we could just say a little bit more about that and how we see the role unfolding.
Go on, Andrea.
Yep, sorry. So, you know, Rick mentioned this earlier, it's really, really important role, we think, and, you know, a number of aspects to it I think are really important. So first of all, it's around that, you know, just challenging the organisation around its performance, you know, making sure the right information is coming up to the board, testing it out, helping, you know, executives to kind of join the dots between some of the information that comes up, and just say, well, what kind of story is this telling us, and what lessons can we draw out here about where services aren't quite working as well as they should be, and we need to go in and do something. So that's one sort of area where the role is really important. I think it's important as well that it's not just, you know, in the slightly ivory tower of the board, but that person sort of gets out and has contacts with people outside of the board environment. So they speak to the complaints team, they speak to residents as well who've received some of these complaint responses and see how they feel about them. So, you know, as well as sort of policy, but how in practice is it working? Now, I don't expect them to do that a lot, you know, but they certainly need to do some of it, you know, to get a sense of how something is, you know, actually working out there. How does it feel for your residents? Are they sort of getting the service that you are being told is being delivered? And then I think the third bit I would say is around, well, actually, once you've done a bit of that, you know, how are residents feeling and what is the data telling us? It's really pushing the organisation around, well, what have we learned here and what are you going to do about it? And then tracking that actually happens as well. So it's taking the learning from all of that information and making it really valuable. But as I say, really tracking that action is taken and it is delivered as well. And within that sort of learning as well, I'd also put, you know, where the Ombudsman issues severe maladministration findings as well. I think that person's got a really important role in making sure any orders that we make are actually delivered to the timescales that are agreed. And maybe bringing some of our other reports, like Rick's mentioned, the one we did on heating and hot water, we've got ones on damp and mold, and just kind of getting the organisation to self-assess how it's performing against the range of recommendations that we're making, and seeing well, actually, are there any gaps here in the services that we're delivering that we should be looking to tackle? And actually, that's something that we'll be doing a bit more on. Another power we have under the new Social Housing Regulation Act around requiring landlords to do self-assessments against some of our good practice in particular instances. So I hope that's helped, but if there's anything else you wanted me to cover, pop that in the chat.
Thank you, Andrea. Really good overview of that. And I think we've got 2 more questions that we've got there, and we've only got 5 minutes, so probably just time for those last 2 questions. And don't worry, Kenya Sue, I've seen your question. Yours is one of the 2, so rest assured that I'm just about to ask it now. And that is, how can residents ensure that landlords adhere to equality, diversity and inclusion frameworks and make sure that they publish these annually? Part of that might be for us, part of that might not be quite under our remit, but just wondered if wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. One of the strong features in our casework is sometimes residents may have protected characteristics that the landlord hasn't necessarily recognised, or there may be additional needs that the disabilities, mental health issues that the landlord hasn't considered. So in a broadest sense, we will want to make sure that the landlord, when we're investigating, when we see those issues, we will want to make sure the landlord has considered those circumstances where appropriate. And we'll obviously use things like the Equality Act, and their own policies, perhaps that they should have in place in relation to reasonable adjustments or vulnerable persons or whatever is appropriate, and consider what their decisions have been under in relation to those those circumstances and their policies. And sometimes, we're obviously finding that landlords have really not had due regard to the Equality Act, or has not followed their policy appropriately, and we're able to set out in the report the consequences of that and the impact that it's had. Now, when it comes to our remedies, we'll obviously tailor those depending on the case that we've dealt with. But we may, for example, say that, and this is an example of a case we did recently where the landlord had not responded well to requests from the resident for reasonable adjustments, and it was evident the landlord didn't actually have a policy or approach on making reasonable adjustments. So kind of staff were struggling to do this consistently and effectively. So one of our remedies there was that the landlord needed to consider how it addressed that and how it closed its gap. In relation to equality, diversity, and inclusion information, I mean, that will ultimately be a kind of decision for the landlord. There's a lot of work that sector bodies like the National Housing Federation are doing around equality, diversity, and inclusion. We ourselves collect information on equality, diversity, and inclusion. We consider that both in terms of how residents are able to engage with our service and how we respond, but also if it's telling us anything about the kind of complaints that we're handling and the issues that we're seeing. And that's something which we're considering at the moment as part of a future deep dive that we're doing into complaints in what's called our Spotlight reports, and that will be an aspect of our next Spotlight report early next year.
Thank you very much, Rick. And then the last question of the night is from Daisy, who has asked about what support we will offer or do offer to housing associations, and I guess other landlords as well included in that, to ensure that long-term changes can be sustainable. So I assume that this is around kind of increased kind of compensation offers and things like that, making sure that that is sustainable amongst the other things that they're juggling.
You want to go for it, Andrea or Danny? Oh.
Do you want to, I was going to say, do you want to go first and I'll add my any other thoughts on?
No, you go for it. You go for it.
Well, I was going to say, so, some of this, the sort of sustainability of housing associations, is more the regulator's role looking at those things than ours. But we are, you know, when we do make recommendations in our spotlight reports and other things, we test those out with sort of experts and a group of landlords beforehand to make sure that they are reasonable recommendations, that they are deliverable as well. And we're not sort of placing, you know, undue burdens, if you like, on landlords, asking them to do things that really are not particularly thought through, not deliverable for them. But I think that the way that we try to get landlords to change and support kind of learning and improvement is really through the transparency of all of the work that we do. So, you know, all of the determinations, the cases that we publish on our website, they're all there as a learning resource for landlords to access. We have all of our severe maladministration reports, which is a higher degree of finding. We encourage landlords to give us a sort of learning statement in response about what they are doing to, you know, deal with a particular challenge that we found, and other landlords can have a look at that. And there's a whole range of other reports and information that we produce that really are there, you know, if landlords want to come in and have a look, they can learn from. And then alongside all of that as well, we hold a whole lot of webinars around all of these various topics where complaint handlers, other people in the organisation, depending on what we're talking about, can come in and listen and learn. And then the final thing I would say is we are developing our Centre for Learning as well, which is going to be something landlords can access to come in and sort of pick up lots of information from all of these various sources and reports. We want to create within that some networks for landlords to talk to each other around, you know, learning what others do, so the wheel doesn't have to be reinvented. And, you know, lots of other information on there as well. So slightly long answer, but I would summarize, you know, we're helping them through transparency in that learning and sharing what good looks like in other places for people to pick up and think, well, can I use that in my organisation as well?
Thank you, Richard. Do you have anything to add on top of that? No. I just thank you to Andrea, Rick and Danny for all of the answers this evening, and thank you so much to all of you for attending and also the questions. Really kind of good. Hopefully you found it insightful and that you learned a lot about the Ombudsman. Any kind of other questions, you obviously feel free to email us and we can try and get those questions answered afterwards. But if there's nothing else, then let's say thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.